Welcome to the UO Today podcast, conversations that offer a glimpse into the heart of the humanities at the University of Oregon. Listen as our faculty, students, and guests introduce ideas and research that help us reflect on the past, navigate the present, and imagine possible futures. I'm Leah Middlebrook, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. And my guest today is Patty Krawec, an Ojibwe Anishinaabe and Ukrainian writer and speaker. An activist and former social worker, she belongs to the Lac Seul First Nation Treaty 3 territory and resides in Niagara Falls, Ontario. Krawec is a founding director of the Niagara Foundation. She has served on the board of the Fort Erie Native Friendship Center and co-hosted the Medicine for Resistance podcast, which I highly recommend. I've been listening to it over the past few days. Her first book, Becoming Kin, an Indigenous Call for Unforgetting the Past and Reimagining Our Future, was published in 2022 by Broadleaf Books. Her second book, about the ways that subaltern writing and storytelling can help us reimagine that future, will be published in the fall of 2025. On February 4th, 2025, Krawec will give a lecture titled Surviving Together as the 2024-25 Robert D. Clark Lecture. Her talk is the first in the Oregon Humanities Center's themed speaker series for this year on the topic Reimagine. Thanks for coming on the show, Patty.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to being with you guys and especially in our current political climate. I think this lecture series that you have planned, this Reimagine, and particularly the idea of surviving together, because so often when we feel threatened, our instinct is to pull inward and to hoard. I mean, we saw what happened to toilet paper at the beginning of the pandemic.
That's right. That's right. Oh my gosh, now you're taking me back. But yes, I agree. I think when we first came across your work, all of us were so excited to bring you, and that was in a very different political moment, but it's only become more important and meaningful to have the kinds of conversations we might be able to have with you. So again, we're just delighted that you're coming soon, and we're happy to be able to have a little bit of a chat beforehand today. I thought I might just start by asking a little bit about your background. If you could tell us a little bit about, how you grew up and how you became engaged with your community.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really long, boring story. Anyway, so I was not raised with my Ojibwe family. My mom had become a teacher and she had gone far to the far north to teach, which is pretty common. It still is pretty common. If you want to get student loans forgiven, whatever, then they send you off to remote places to go and work there. And that's what she did. And while she was there, she met my father, got married, had me. Marriage ended. She brought me south. I was raised with her family. And my mom's family are German Ukrainian refugees. They fled Stalin and then wound up in American occupied Germany and then refugeed here to Canada. They almost went to Paraguay, in which case I would have had, a much different life if I even existed. But anyway, so they wound up here, and so that's where I was raised. I found my father almost by accident when I was in my mid-20s. I came across somebody who knew him and asked if he happened to know where Roy was, and it turned out that Roy was actually quite nearby. Now, growing up in the 70s, and it's not that weird because people are still surprised that Indigenous people still exist. I still come across people that are surprised that we still exist. So it's not that weird that growing up in Southern Ontario, I didn't know that there were any Native people around me, that I thought they all lived out west somewhere. But when I found him, and so people always knew I was Native. Like it wasn't a secret in my family. I mean, I was the brown kid in the white family. People always asked me like, where are you from? What are you? It was always a great question. So other people recognized me as being different, as not, where are you from? You obviously look different. Anyway, so I found my father and I figured if he was nearby, then there are probably other indigenous people nearby. There were probably other Indians. That was, there's other Native people nearby. And so I started looking for them in friendship. I found them in friendship centers. I found them in powwows. I found them in round dances. I found them and I started building relationships. And so in a lot of ways, the things that I invite settlers, newcomers, people to do, because Becoming Kin is written primarily for nice white people, white people who want to do better, who understand that the stories they've been told don't really match with the things that they're learning. And so they want to understand history differently. They want to understand, or develop or have a relationship with the native people that they're just figuring out actually still exist. And so I'm asking them to do the same things that I did, except of course I was doing it as a native person who always kind of felt outside the world that I was in, which isn't to say that my mom's family didn't love me. They did. I was well loved, well cared for, but I was still raised in the times of the 60s scoop, right? So being
Mhm.
native was also something to be worried about
Mhm.
from my mom's point of view. The idea that we were genetically predisposed to alcoholism was very prevalent. And so, I got that warning all the time. So being native was simultaneously this, mystical thing that I had to live up to in terms of all of the good things that we hear about native people, the generosity, the communal, the focus on community and no hierarchies, kind of collective decision making. So having to live up to all of that, but simultaneously having to be very concerned about all of these ticking time bombs of, mental health and anger and, addiction and all of these things that were somehow believed to be inherent to Native people and that she was trying to protect me from.
Mhm.
So, so it was both of those things. And then finding my father, that started me looking for Native people and building those relationships, always being able to identify my father as Roy, and then being able to give my clan, which is Caribou, and kind of showing people kind of how I fit in. And I understand that like Longhouse, things are a little bit different in terms of how their system of governance works. But out east, for the Ojibwe people, it's very much a clan system, mostly animals, but not exclusively animals. So yeah, so I started building those relationships and then I don't know more happened,
Mhm.
which, then my relations and my understanding of how I fit into the world took a political turn.
Mhm.
Because now it's not just about me and my community and becoming friends and building relationships. Now it's all these things in the context of a government that's trying to erase us, that's trying to take what little we have left and push us, and push us so far into the margins that we
Yeah.
come out the other side as Canadians.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so that's my trajectory. But I
Mhm.
think about often a lot is kind of these twin things that I've inherited. So on my father's side is the responsibility to Indigenous people and place and our relationship, is being tied to this place and our relationships to the other beings of this place.
Mhm.
But then on the other side, on my maternal side, it's the refugees and the migrants and the people, how do you enter a place?
Right.
How do you enter a place and be a good friend, a good relative to the original people of that place? And I'm cognizant of that when I travel to do
Mhm.
speaking engagements in other places, that in that moment, I am the guest in somebody else's land. And so what messages am I bringing that will help those communities? That won't just impose an Ojibwe way of being in a place that's not Ojibwe. So although I tell Ojibwe stories because those are my stories, I always encourage my listeners when I'm outside of Ojibwe lands to think about the stories in those places and what do those stories have to teach them about how to live in that place. Because Ojibwe stories are good for teaching you how to live in Ojibwe places, because the characters are all animals and plants and landscapes that are familiar to Ojibwe people, but those aren't necessarily going to be familiar things in your area. We have salmon,
Yeah.
but they're not quite the big deal that they are out there. You know?
Right. Right. And I think that that's that's a point that you make in sort of on so many different levels over the course of being kin. So you give us specific instructions, but there's also something about your prose style that is always, or I felt certainly very welcomed and actually addressed in my own field of expertise because I work in the 16th and 17th centuries. I work on the colonizers, the settlers. Um, and at the same time, I think you help us look at narratives that some of us grew up with and understand that those were stories that were telling us how to be in this place. So I think that's managed so deftly in Being Kin, and I want to come back to that in a few minutes. But I also wanted to ask about another dimension of your story that comes up, which has to do with your relationship to evangelical churches.
Oh,
So
yeah.
you talk a lot about that. What role does faith and what role does religion have in your life now?
Oh gosh, my kid asked me this a couple of weeks ago. So I have three boys. They're all in their 30s. They're all, grown and gone. My grandson is in the other room right now making cookies with his grandpa. Gingerbread house, I think. Like an old, yeah, anyway, we're
Tasty.
disconnected from time around here sometimes. So they're working on, I think it's a gingerbread house that they're working on. Anyway, you can edit all that out.
No,
But
I'm gonna
yes,
keep it.
one of
I
my
want to know the recipe,
okay.
but I also want to hear about the church.
One of my sons asked me that question a few weeks ago because it really has evolved a lot. Yes. So up until I was about 9, there was no church at all. My mom and I lived with my grandma, with my grandparents. And then when I was 9, she remarried, and we started going to evangelical churches because that was her husband. And this was in the 70s, late 70s. And so that was when like the Jesus People movement and all of that stuff was happening, right? That was part of it was presented as part of a counterculture. But what it really was a conservative response to counterculture to try to keep the hippies on track, right? Like let's get control of them by giving them cool music and all of this stuff. So that's what I was raised in. And also, that end times theology of, the rapture is coming and the Antichrist is coming. And like, it's so traumatizing, that whole theology. And so now what I would say, Hmm. So I actually had a very clear moment when I was sitting in church one time. This was during I Don't Know More, when I was starting to understand my relations as having a political dimension, as well as, social and cultural. I started to understand it as having a political dimension and a political responsibility to take actions against injustice collectively rather than individually. And I had a very clear, I don't know if you want to call it a vision or an auditory hallucination or whatever you want to call it, that I was going to have to choose, that I could not choose both. And it seemed to me that this was Jesus talking, that this path I had to choose. And I was like, how do I choose anything but being Ojibwe? That makes no, like, I'm Ojibwe. I can't choose anything other than being Ojibwe. And I continued going to church and looking for common ground. And I think there is common ground in some ways that you could read the Bible. I don't think the evangelical understanding is inevitable. I think there's a lot of ways that we can read these stories. And so I started letting go of these ideas of inerrancy and literalism and like all of this stuff I started letting go of all of these things. And the answer that I gave to my boy, who got a much shorter answer because he's been with me through all of that stuff, um, was that I no longer believe that the church is the only source of truth or the only way that we can meaningfully access the spiritual world around us. Right? Because the church would say if you're accessing the spiritual world around you and you're doing it outside of the church, what you're accessing is demonic. That was what I was raised to believe. I no longer believe that. I think that I think that we're surrounded by a spiritual world. We're full of sentient spiritual beings, and there's all kinds of ways to be in relationship with them. But I think these relations of power that too much of the church has embraced has shut them off from those relations, has disconnected them from the land. And I talk a bit about that in Becoming Kin, about this idea that if we're all come from this garden in the Middle East, then we're all disconnected from land because we don't live there anymore. we moved to Europe and now we Christianity moved here and it's disconnected from place. I don't think it has to be disconnected from place, but I have not found a Christian community that is not in some capacity disconnected that way. So I'm sticking with my choice. I'm Ojibwe.
I'm very interested to hear you say that because something I noticed you just do very skillfully in Becoming Kin is presenting chapter and verse from a certain section of the Bible and and then talking about how it speaks to you and using that as a path into helping your reader attend exactly to the kinds of spiritualities that surround us, for example, in rocks or in plants. So there were a few times in the book where there's one passage I'm thinking of in particular where a Bible studies teacher was asking you to think about the exile and the wandering in the desert and the having to walk. You stage it so beautifully, but having to walk 900 miles and they say to you, can you imagine doing that? And you say, yes, I
Yeah.
can.
And I
Can you?
remember that day so clearly because there's a black man sitting right in front of me. And I'm thinking, I bet he can imagine that too. I bet he can also imagine what that must have been like for ancestors to leave the land of their birth and cross a whole ocean into exile, into an exile from which they can never return. I can go home. My friend Carrie can't go home. You
Mhm.
know,
Right.
she doesn't even know where home is. And there's a lot of books written about that, about, people raised in descendants of African slaves going back to Africa and the challenges that they have. Ta-Nehisi Coates was most recently talked about it in his book, but Saidiya Hartman talks about that in Lose Your Mother. And it's heartbreaking
Mhm.
because, the paths have diverged. Yaga Yassi the beautiful book called Homecoming
I
Fiction, which
love
is
that book. Yeah.
gorgeous. But it tackles that as well from the strains of these two families. And I mean, in Native communities, we can see that too, from the scoops, you go home and you don't fit in anymore, right? But we still have a home to go to. We still have families that we can connect with. We still have relations. My son goes home, my oldest, often goes home to Lac Seul and has a lot of relationships there. And so although, and it's probably mostly on me that I don't kind of feel that same connection because maybe I'm coming to it too late or maybe I just don't know how to do it, but he's doing it and that makes
Mhm.
me really happy. That just makes me really happy that he's able to do it and build those relations and he's able to go home. And for me, I think that that is a huge responsibility for our communities, especially right now when so many people are in such danger, like we're on the edge of a lot of danger and it's going to become more dangerous. I think we have a responsibility as the original people of this place to say not on our land, not in our name, and to enact that generosity of our ancestors that was never the problem. Like you always see those things, right? Should have had better homeland security and all of that stuff.
Mhm.
But the fact is that the generosity of our ancestors was not the problem. It was never the problem. It was the exploitation of that generosity was the problem. And I don't want to dishonor that aspect of our ancestors by saying they shouldn't have done it. Why would I ask them to be anyone other than who they are?
Sure. And again, I think, to keep repeating, how successfully you accomplish these moves in being kin, but I think that really comes forward with your constant sort of naming of your ancestors and thinking about what each one brings to the picture of who you are. And then it's nice to hear you talking today about, your son as an inheritor of all of that and taking another step.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, for settlers, newcomers, calling it whatever however you want to understand your relationship to this place, to do that as well. Because on my
Mhm.
maternal side, I've got some great ancestors there too. But there's also ones that you don't want to think about. Like right now, what I'm thinking about a lot is how my grandma, in fleeing Stalin, found safety under Hitler because she was German. She was a German expat, part of that group that Catherine the Great brought into Ukraine. So when Ukraine became dangerous for her, she was able to flee went to Germany, where she was welcomed because she was German, because these communities in Ukraine stayed very insulated, very isolated. They stayed German. They stayed German Mennonites, in particular, right? They stayed German Mennonites. And when she fled the dangers of Stalin, she found safety under Hitler. She was given housing, she was given a job, she was taken care of. And right now, we can see how people will gravitate towards that stuff if it makes them safe, right? Like our politicians will give us all kinds of people to blame for our current circumstances, and then the people who feel safe. And so I'm feeling that very deeply right now on my grandma's side. And it would be easy for me to ignore that, to pretend that, like that's an
Yeah,
uncomfortable part of my history. I don't want to think about that.
right.
But I can't transform what I don't think about. I can't transform what I don't name. And so, although there's a lot of good things, a lot of excellent things in my grandma, a lot of excellent things in that side of the family, I have to acknowledge that part and then transform it and say, okay, if she found safety in a place that made other people profoundly unsafe, then I'm going to think about those people who were made unsafe and think about what can I do to make sure that they are safe in my current context here, because I can't change what happened then, but I can do something about similar political currents here and now. And I think everybody needs to do that. Everybody needs to think about who their ancestors are and what they're bringing forward into this place. And I talk about that a lot in my next book as well, which is actually, we have a title. It's called Bad Indians Book Club. And it will be available for sale in I don't know when. I'm hoping soon. We're just waiting on the title. But it kind of expands a lot of the ideas in Becoming Kin, and it expands it out of history, where Becoming Kin focuses on history, because I think that's really important. Like the place to begin. But I also talk about listening to Indigenous and marginalized people in the sciences, in gender writing, in memoir, and then we get into fiction and horror fiction and futurisms, and like, what do we do when we listen to the people from the margins? How do their voices help us imagine that better world that Becoming Kin wants us to imagine? So for me, it's kind of a sequel. I didn't mean it that way. But I guess there's just a lot of ideas of Becoming Kin that I wanted to continue, that I wanted to continue working with.
And you just drew such a helpful distinction too, that becoming kin really does present the history. And then what I'm hearing you talking about now is something I've been reflecting a lot on too recently, that there is a much larger shared experience. And the more we can sort of decenter ourselves in our own private experience of whatever it is going on and look at the larger picture, it is complex, it is deeply enmeshed in all kinds of ways. And I think you're really bringing that forward.
Well, and there's so many ways that these things are connected, right? And that's something that I hear a lot from readers of Becoming Kin, is that what makes my book unique is, and I hadn't really thought about it as unique. I had just thought about it as angry. So the generous invitational piece is always a surprise to me, because I wasn't feeling that way when I wrote it. I was angry. But it had occurred to me that I could do something with my anger, that I could shape the stories that were being told, that I didn't have to just sit behind my computer screen and seethe on Twitter or Facebook. And Twitter is like the only dead name I'll ever use. But, I didn't have to sit back and seethe and, just kind of post my anger all day long. I could actually write a book and shape people's thoughts. And then this is where my social work background comes in. Because for 16 years, I was trained to review history and look for patterns.
Hmm.
Look,
That makes
because
so
that's the
much
first
sense.
thing you do when you get a new referral, right? You look through your agency's history with this family. Have we been involved before? Have we been involved with their parents, their grandparents? How far back what are the patterns over the course of generations? How do different things connect together? How is, dad's alcoholism connected to great grandma's domestic violence experience of domestic violence? And so that's what I want. That's what I did with Becoming Kin. I was trained to review history and look for patterns, look for connections. And that's what Becoming Kin did. And that's what I hear from people. They say they hadn't thought about these things as being connected. And I
Hmm.
think that's a lot of what settler history, colonial ways of teaching history do, is they package it in silos so that politicians can apologize for Japanese internment, as if that was just kind of this unique little bubble that never ha that isn't connected to any other land grabs that were also going on over the course of American history. Or they can apologize for, Canada has apologized for turning away, I think it's the Category Maru, a refugee ship, as if they hadn't
Yes.
also turned away other refugee ships and aren't currently turning away refugees, right? Like they seem to see, and this is the way we teach history, but it's not. These things are connected. They're all different strategies to accomplish the same goal. And I think also the Black experience is connected to the Indigenous experience. It's connected to what's happening in Palestine. It's connected to what happened in Ireland. It's connected to what's going on in Congo. These things aren't just similar. They're materially connected. And I think in activist circles, we talk about this a lot, but in mainstream, we don't. We talk about these kind of isolated hotspots. We don't talk about how they're materially connected and our struggles. And I think that's really important as activists and educators to think about how we are working collectively to address these things. Because we know that the people who orchestrate this stuff are getting together every year in Davos and all those other places to orchestrate collectively. They are very well organized. We need to be organized too.
So the book club is the first step in that organizing. We're going to read a syllabus and move forward together. Is that part of it?
You know what? Book clubs have had a long, long history of consciousness raising and organizing. The Combahee River Collective started as a reading group.
Right.
Look what they've done. They've changed the way we talk about the intersection of our identity and our politics. They've completely changed the world. And I've had the good fortune to get to know Demita Frazier, who's a wonderful human being, and to, have conversations with her and, just about the work that we do. And yeah, reading groups, they sound so basic, but when we get together and we read dangerous books and we have these conversations about these dangerous books, they change us. And then we go into the places where policy is made and we change those policies. Or we can take a stand against something because we've got people who we can take a stand with. We're not alone. And I think reading groups, and that's, Bad Indians Book Club is all about that, has so much power to change everything.
I I absolutely agree with you. And it's something else I think about all the time in terms of reading groups and focusing together on, yeah, on a specific text, on a specific book, right? Is it also unleashes all kinds of affinity and good feeling and love and sort of care for the other. And all of that is such an important part of collective work. And I think
Mhm.
reading is particularly keyed to releasing those feelings in us.
Oh, for sure. Because there's always something that you see, like, oh, I hadn't thought about it like that. Or you had thought about it like that, but wow, this is just articulated so beautifully.
Right. And this person across the room from you who you've never met had exactly the same response. Right?
Yeah, now you're best friends.
Yeah, yeah. You've used one term that I wanted to come back to, which is idle no more. I think maybe some of our guests won't know about that. And before we finish our conversation, I'd also like to hear a little bit about land back. So could we maybe talk about idle no more first?
Sure. So Idle No More was a movement that started in, I think it was 2012. Um, in Canada, they're called omnibus bills, where it's, there's going to be a particular piece of legislation. And I think this is also pretty common in the US, where there's a piece of legislation, and then they kind of tack on, all kinds of stuff that doesn't really have anything to do with the main with the main piece of legislation. They're just little riders that get tacked on. And what happens is you just keep tacking on these riders, and now you've got this massive bill that was gonna pass, and and it had to do with environmental and issues, water in particular. And these four women, Sylvia McAdam was one of them, were just like, we're done. We're finished. We have sat on the sidelines. We have been nice. We have we have done all of the acceptable things. We educated ourselves, we joined committees, we got into politics, like we did all of the things we're supposed to do. And this is our reward. Our reward is the exact opposite of everything that we've been working towards. And so they called it Idle No More, which was kind of an unfortunate title, just because it allowed for too many other people to, to be snarky with, well, I've never been idle. These women were never idle either. These women have worked very hard. Um, but it was that kind of collective movement that they were building. And so there was a winter where we just did round dances, and that was where I got pulled in. And if you have ever watched, those birds getting ready to migrate, and they kind of swoop down, and every time they swoop down, the flock gets bigger.
Yeah.
And then when they've got all of them, the birds fly off. That's what these round dances were for Idle No More. Every time they had one, they caught more of us and pulled us into community, into the circle. And then they started doing a lot of teach-ins. And part of the problem with Idle No More was it was very decentralized. There weren't, other than this one piece of legislation, there weren't a lot of specific asks. So although the relationships were built, the political movement kind of lost steam. And you see that happen a lot, right? You see that that happened with Occupy. That happens with a lot of our movements. Is they build quickly and then they seem to run out of steam. And so that's kind of what happened with Idle No More. But that transformed a lot of Native people. I wasn't the only one who started seeing my relations as having now a political component and responsibility. Land back is, of course, part of that. So I can segue into land back if you
Sure,
want.
let's do that. Yes, thank you.
So land back is, it was a hashtag for a while, but it also looks at changing our relationship to land. At its core, it is about restoring land to the original peoples of that place. It's not necessarily about, individual homeowners, deeding their property to a nearby reserve, although people have done that. They can do that. It's terrific. Go ahead, do it. I'm not going to say no. There's land trusts that you can donate to where Native people are literally buying back their land. Which again, in this current climate is probably smart because reservations are actually federally owned. So if the US government decides, and it does periodically decide that a tribe is too small, or that they're not, and they rescind that federal recognition, and then that land reverts to the federal government. That's another way of getting more land. So the tribes actually owning their own land politically makes sense to do that. But it's also about rethinking our relation to land. How do we use land? Are we, as a university, when we're making decisions about land use, about building, about whatever, are we consulting the local tribes? Do they have veto power? Can they say, no, that's actually a terrible way to build your property? When we get our building permits from the city, are we also seeking advice from the local people who know how the waterways work and stuff like that? Are we joining with, I think there were just some dams that were decommissioned. Was that in Oregon that happened?
Yes, yes. And in
Yeah.
Washington. Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. The dams that were, are we working with Native people who are, trying to do that? Are we leveraging our own positions in order to be able to provide them with support or access to the people that they need access to in order to get that stuff? So land back means a lot of things. At its core, it means remembering that the original peoples of this place have never ceded territory. The treaties that we signed were all with the understanding that we would be sharing the land, not that the hard boundaries, because we didn't have hard boundaries. So we would not have understood the territories that way, the treaties that way, because we didn't have hard boundaries. We understood them as language. This is, we're going to share, and you're going to be responsible for this, and we're going to be responsible for that, and we're going to live. And that's, of course, we know that that's not what happened. But individuals, people always worry about, what about my home? What about my home? And I'm like, you know what? We're not going to send everybody back to Europe. One, that's ridiculous. How are we even going to do that? Like, where do I go? Right? Are we going to do blood quantum? If you're not 50%, you don't get to stay. And where's everybody? What are we going We're 6% of the population. What are we going to do with 15 houses each? That makes absolutely no sense. I mean, I can think of a few people, but Europe has enough of its own problems. They don't need us to send those people there. It means living together in this place in a good way, in restoring the land to the original people. And also, I think the churches could give back the land. I think the denominations could give back. I don't understand how you preach grace and all of that stuff that you preach in church while occupying stolen land. That makes no sense to me.
So much to talk about. I'm so glad that you're going to be visiting us in just a few weeks. I have been speaking with Patty Krawec, Ojibwe Anishinaabe and Ukrainian writer and speaker. And on February 4th, 2025, Krawec will give her lecture titled Surviving Together as the Robert D. Clark Lecturer for 2024-25. Her talk is the first in the Oregon Humanities Center's themed speaker series on the topic of Reimagine. Patty, thank you so much for your time today, and we really look forward to your visit.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I am really excited to be there.
UO Today is a production of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Thanks for listening.